We know this particular reading to be what is often called the Lord's Prayer. And of course, a lot of people would suggest that maybe John 17 should have been called the Lord's Prayer. It's more lengthy and it was at the end of Jesus' ministry, but this is a very special prayer. It was offered at a special time as well. The disciples had been out on a mission and they came back and it had a lot of success and they reported that. And when they did, they were all excited about what had happened. And Jesus even mentioned that he saw Satan falling from the heavens like a lightning bolt, that he was being brought down by what they were doing. Quite an eventful day. And they were excited about the fact that the demons were actually responding to them and obeying their voices and commands. And so as you think about those factors, then you begin to wonder, if you think chronologically, why they would ask when they came back from that mission if Jesus could teach them to pray. And that is what happened. As you put all of the Gospels together, you get all of this information. But it seems like they did an awful good job. I mean, really a great effort without being taught how to pray. And I've often thought, how in the world did that happen? I know in my own experiences, I would probably never have sent anybody out that hadn't already been taught how to pray. And they probably knew how to pray. They just wanted Jesus to help them. And so he did. But one of the very interesting factors about this prayer is it's very short, very to the point. And I just want to look at one part of that particular prayer today with you, as he says, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come," and of course we know that refers to the church. "Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And there's just so many things about this that are, kind of difficult to contemplate or understand or see the depth of them. But for Jesus to say, "May your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven," makes me to think, and I'm so accustomed to doing Wednesday nights, I'm about ready to ask questions of everybody, but I'll stay with the message. And you think about in heaven, his will was being done in heaven. Well, to understand that, you just need to go back and read the book of Revelation, and you'll see just how much the heavenly host are in subjection to God the Creator, God the Sustainer, God the Savior, God the Rock, and how they do not usurp authority from him. That was attempted on one occasion, and we see in 2 Peter chapter 2 that there are angels that were rejected by God, who were locked in chains of darkness, it says, and then escorted off to Hades to wait for the final judgment, which will come upon all humanity as well. And as you think about his will being done in heaven and the obedient servants that are around his throne, and those that will be joining him because they served him faithfully here on this earth, you can ask a jillion questions that you can't have answered yet, but that we'll someday know. It's almost frightening to think of the majesty of what we're reading about, and then to know that we're going to witness that we're going to have our opportunity. Oops. We've got another visitor here to our Bible study today. We call him Buddy. He is a robot. And he's just about 10 feet away from me, and he cranked up by the time we're getting ready to go. This is going to be fun. We're going to have fun. And so anyways, you think about God and all of his majesty and power, eternal, divine. There's just so many things that we could say about him that do not describe us. And then Jesus saying, "May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And yet I see here, Peter telling us that it wasn't always true that every every being, every spiritual being obeyed God. The angels rebelled against God. And there's lots of conjecture as to what caused that, how it happened, and when it happened. And we don't have those answers, and they're not necessary for us. But we do know that apparently those that remained who were not cast out were faithful to the Lord, and they serve him. And the ladies have been studying during the course of the week angels and seen all kinds of participation in angelic beings in the life of the prophets of old and the lives of the apostles that came later. I mean, you read about the burning bush that wasn't consumed that Moses saw, but if you don't read carefully, you might miss that the angel of the Lord was in that bush, and that's where that glory was coming from. And then you think about Michael and Gabriel, dealing with Persia, and then you come to the New Testament and you see that Gabriel is back and he's announcing the birth of John the Baptist. He's announcing the birth of Jesus and announcing to the shepherds what's going to take place. A lot of faithful servants in heaven. And so, yes, God's will is being done in heaven. But then you think about earth. May your will be carried out. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Has that prayer been answered positively through the years? The answer is no. As you look back on man's history after the creation, God, who has all power, all knowledge, and is ever present, was able to bring the universe into existence just by speaking. And that's why he has the right, the authority to address us and tell us everything that we ought to be doing. And also his holiness would provide him with that same kind of authority, because he and he alone is totally perfect. And so as we think about his power and what happened after just a short time, he created man. And when he created Adam and Eve, he told them what they couldn't do and what they could do. And we know about the fruit in the garden. And we know that they sinned. And the reason is because they had free will. We're talking about God's will in this prayer, that his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then we think about the fact that he gave man free will. And I'm not going to go into a long sermon or a theological explanation of that, but a simple little idea is this. On my back porch every year, some kind of a bird, and it seems like every year is different, comes and builds a nest. And it's amazing to watch the mother bird, who knows she's getting ready to lay an egg. And I don't know who told her that she was getting ready to have an egg, but she knows, builds a nest. And I don't know who taught her how to build a nest, but somehow she knows. As a matter of fact, when she finishes, I look at her little nest and I think, I could never do this. I don't have the skills for that. I could do a little basket weaving maybe, but these birds are unreal. But it's all by instinct. It's not by will. And so the animals are not accused of sinning because they just operate off of instinct and don't have a will of their own. We do. And so I guess we could say that the animals that live on this planet and serve by instinct do a better job of doing God's will than some of us. Certainly a lot better than the ones that God said that he repented that he had made, that he decided to destroy. And we know the story of the flood, and we know that there were escapees. There were, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Doesn't say that Noah and his family all found grace in the eyes of the Lord, but because Noah did, his family was spared. And so 8 people went into the ark and came out of the ark, and the human race was spared, and they started over again. But as you think about the lives they were living that caused the flood to be brought on and caused God to say that he repented that he had made man, their lives were, the people of that generation were worthy of what they got. They were punished for their sins, and they didn't do what they did by instinct. They did it with a knowledge of God. They knew about the presence of God. They knew about the will of God over their lives. because God has his will and he executes his will over our will. And we're to submit to his will, just like the angels in heaven submit to the will of God. And so Jesus prays and he says, your name is hallowed and your kingdom is coming. And may you be served as faithfully by those that are on the planet as those that are not subject any longer to your authority because they died for rebellion. So I think about God's will and God's will being done on earth. And I think about how poor a job mankind has done and how we're not creatures of instinct. And I'm glad I'm not a creature of instinct. I'm glad that God made me with the ability to think, reason, respond, obey, disobey. And what Jesus was doing was encouraging us to be like he was, because he said, that he came into this world to do the will of his Father. And in John 6:34, he says, my food is to do of the will of he who sent me and to finish his work. He came here to be obedient. And in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 and 9, we know that he learned obedience when he came into this world, became the Son of God, born of a woman, living a human life and then dying. And we know that he was human because he actually did, as a mortal, die. But we think about God's will and our will, and we see Jesus doing the will of the Father rather than his own will, and we stand in awe of Jesus. And we ask ourselves, how am I doing on that one? Jesus says, I came to do the will of the Father. That's my food. What is food? Well, it's what sustains us. We can't live without food. And so he says, I just have to do the will of the Father. That sustains me. That's my purpose. That's my reason. It's my lifeline. And then I ask, is that true of me? Do I really have that kind of commitment and devotion before God? Or have I done like some of the people did before the flood came, which God promised he wouldn't do again, but he is going to call us into reckoning in the last day. We will be judged, but I wonder how I am doing in trying to keep God's will here on earth. And I suspect that I've, in many ways, not done well. But we do want to do the will of God. And we do want to know what the will of God is. And we do find opportunities to serve him. He gives us the opportunities if we're just avail ourselves of them. And we can be pleasing to him if we want to be, or we can be disobedient and suffer the consequences of that as well. So Jesus prayed that God's will would be done on earth. And if that's the case, it's going to depend on human beings. It's not going to depend on the animals. They don't have that will that we do. And it's going to depend on us trying to be like Jesus and discover what the will of God for our lives is, and then to do it faithfully and to show him how much we love him. Jesus said in Matthew 7:21, not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And so Jesus makes it real clear that God's expecting us to do his will or else suffer the consequences. And he says, not everybody that calls me Lord is going to be saved. We know that there are just a lot of people that teach, even theologically teach in their churches, that if you know who God is and if you know who Jesus is, that you'll go to heaven when you die. But that doesn't seem to be what Jesus taught here in Matthew 7. He says that you have to do the will of the Father. You have to be obedient. And there's a lot of instruction in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament about being obedient to God, finding out what his will is. But one of the things that we need to do is not second guess the God who gave us the opportunity to live and breathe, exist, and eventually die and be with him in heaven. We know that sometimes men have their own will rather than God's will, and sometimes it's sinful, sometimes it's not sinful. I mean, we know in James chapter 4, the Bible tells us that individuals do what several did in that chapter and decide between the two of them that they're going to go and spend a year in a certain city, this one or that one. The writer of James says that they don't know what their life is. What is your life? It's but a vapor that appears for a moment and then disappears. So Jesus taught the fact that man is mortal and won't live forever. He came, joined us, and he also died to be able to please the Father, to do the will of the Father so that we could have salvation. But the writer of James tells us here that some people just think they can plan anything and it's going to happen. Well, I'm looking out my window right now and there's a blizzard out there, and we'd hope to be meeting at the hotel today. But sometimes we don't have control over everything that happens around us. And we know that our life is as a vapor, and we're going to plan to go into the city and sell and buy and make a lot of profit. And James says, don't count on that. You can't really count on that. And then Hebrews chapter 6, verse 3 says that we ought to try to go from a level of spiritual maturity where we're drinking milk like an infant to a more mature stage where we're eating meat, and that we ought to really concentrate, once we've learned the basics, on getting down to understanding the more complex matters of God and his scriptures and what he has revealed to us. And he closes that paragraph, the Hebrew writer does, saying in chapter 6, verse 3, and God permitting, that's what we will do. And when you stop to think about it, everything we do is according to the will of God or in contrast to the will of God. Or we find that because of our ignorance and not knowing what God permits and doesn't permit, sometimes what he would like, what he doesn't like, we don't always get it right. But Jesus said we ought to be trying to know the will of the Father like he did, and that we should be submissive to the will of the Father. But we've seen through the generation of Noah that not everybody does that. And then not everybody that thinks that just because they have a knowledge of God, they're going to go to heaven will. No, it depends on whether or not we do his will. And I think that, we need to recognize, even from what we studied that last week, when we were talking about the selection of someone that was going to be king over the nation of Israel. David was picked, but why? He is the son of Jesse, and Samuel was sent to pick out somebody from Jesse's household. And he looked at Eliab and thought, oh, Eliab's a big guy, kind of like Saul, who was being deposed, and said, maybe that's the one. But God told Samuel, no, he's not the one. The one I want is Jesse's little boy that's out still in the field being a shepherd right now, not even in here. Go get him, because I want David to be king. Why? Because I'm looking at his heart. And so Samuel learned that lesson, that God doesn't always look at a man's outward appearance, his stature, but looks at his heart. Well, we can't look at men's heart, but God can. And he knows when we are submissive to his will and when we're not, and when we're doing his will. But also we realize in reading this story that God has a will of his own. He did when he said, let there be light. Who gave him the instructions to do that? Nobody. And when he calls for the end of the world and the universe and decides to turn out the lights and let the universe be consumed in fire, who's going to tell him to do that? No one. That's his will, and he will do it when he's ready. And so we need to realize that God has a will for us, and we need to discover it and do what he wants us to do. And then, there's just so many cases in the scriptures that we could refer to. I'm thinking about Solomon now. David wanted to build a temple for God, and he had been the one that God had selected because he has this great heart. But then all of a sudden, God says, no. It's not my will that you build a temple. I want your son to build the temple because you've been a warrior, you've been a king, and under your leadership, a lot of people have died. A lot of blood has been shed. And so No, you're not my choice. And so God has his will as to who will do what, when, where, and how. And all I need to do is say, God, I'm your servant. I'll do whatever you want, whenever you want, wherever you want, how you want it done. And I won't argue with you about anything. But then what about people that pray? You know, you go back to the book of James and you see again this idea that God has a will of his own. In James 5:17, it says that, you know, Elijah prayed. And when he prayed, God answered his prayer by cutting off rainfall from the land of Judea for 3.5 years. And then he prayed again out of faith in God, and God caused it to rain. Well, all of these incidents show that we also have an opportunity to talk to God. I think about Abraham back in Exodus 19 when God's getting ready to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot's down in the valley, and that, you know, family to Abraham. He had given Lot the chance to go down to that part of the valley and have the best pasture around rather than go himself. But God was going to destroy everybody down in that valley and the cities that were there, the 5 cities. And so Abraham argues with him almost. I mean, it's a debate, it's negotiations, and talks about, well, would you destroy everybody down there if there were 50 righteous people? Would you destroy the righteous with the unrighteous? And you know the story. It goes down to 10 people. And God says, no, if there's 10 people down there, I won't destroy the cities. But there wasn't. And so Lot and his wife and the rest of his family had a chance to get out. And of course, his daughters were married and their husbands didn't want to get out. That wasn't their will. They stayed. And they weren't supposed to look back when they ran for their lives. And Lot's wife did, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. And so there weren't 10 righteous people that needed to get out of town, but God listened to Abraham because, again, as James chapter 2 mentions, the book of James is full of stories about faith, but it talks about how that God was a friend of Abraham's, and Abraham was his friend, and he loved Abraham, and so he spared a few people because of Abraham's negotiations with him. Now, that means I can go to God in prayer if I'm a faithful servant, and I can also ask God, please, Lord, give us a break so that next weekend we can have a beautiful day without any snow for everybody to be there. Please, Lord, help Juwan and his family and Marshall and his family get back from their vacation someday. And I'm sure that there's somebody that would like to see, Angela wants to see her husband again. And so, Garth, you need to plan on also trying to make reservations and get out of town. But we can pray, and we can pray for Jana not to have cancer. We can pray for a lot of the people that we know and care about to have God's help and God's support and backing, and he will actually listen to us. It's amazing. It is amazing when you see how abusive we are of the will that God has given us, how faithful God is in his will toward us and all the angelic beings and the universe itself, and to know that he would listen to us, that he would take us into consideration at all, but he does. And he did. And that's where I want to stress the point that the one who asks God to be conscious of our needs and ask us to do God's will and prayed that God's will would be done on earth, Jesus, was the one who went to the Garden of Gethsemane and prayed. 3 times he prayed the same words. So he believed also that God's will can be touched with our feelings and emotions and our desires. And he prayed for his own situation. He knew he was getting ready to be crucified. He knew he was getting ready to be flogged. He already announced it. You go back to Luke 18, you see it in verse 30 and 31, that he knew exactly who he knew he was going to be spat upon. He knew that. But he asked his father, he says, if it's possible, if there's any other way, so that this cup that I'm going to have to drink, I wouldn't have to drink it if I could escape the consequences of my decision to come here and to die on the cross according to your will, Father. Then take that into consideration, please. But there wasn't. And he said, but not my will, but your will be done. And when we talk about doing the will of God, you couldn't ask for a more perfect example than Jesus saying, I would rather not be spat upon, beaten, flogged. I'd rather not be nailed to the cross. I'd rather not die in disgrace in the presence of my mother and my best friend. If there's any way, Lord, but I do not want anything to happen, and I don't want to do anything that would be contrary to your will. And we know that, Hebrews 2 says that Jesus was mortal. He was a human being. And we know that he was flesh and blood, John 1:14. And he lived a human life like us and had all of the suffering that we might have in this world. But and so we see his humanity really, really being seen when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. But then he closes the way he lived. His food was to do the will of the Father. And he said, but not my will be done, but your will be done. He prayed, may Father, your will be done here on earth. And to make that possible, he died on the cross to make the will of the Father possible. And he was an obedient son. He learned obedience by the things he suffered, Hebrews 5, 8, and 9, and he did. And he put God's will above his own will. And then as I think about all these things, I read these verses and I think, am I doing that? Am I really letting God's will be my will, irrespective of any consequence I might face? Would I have done what Jesus did? And I believe there are a lot of people that have made that kind of a choice, given their life for somebody else, and hard times where there's conflict between nations. Many people have given up their life to save the life of someone else. And just disasters, human disasters. There are people that have run into a burning building to save somebody's life or a child or something, and then they themselves perish. That happened at 9/11 up in, the towers. That was horrible. But a lot of people died trying to save the lives of others and so forth. So it is possible for us to put our will aside and to give God the option. And then sometimes for frivolous reasons, we tend to put our will above God's will and do what we want to do, not what we know God would prefer that we do or has told us he would like for us to do. And so we want to be the kind of people that when it's all over, Jesus will say, as he mentions here in Matthew 25, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in a few things, I will make you ruler over many things. And so to do that, though, we have to have the Spirit of Jesus, follow his example, and remember that we're walking in his footsteps, 1 Peter 2:21. And that he is our example. When Paul says, I've been crucified, I no longer live. Christ lives in me, Galatians 2:20. Those verses that just ring out about Jesus's faithfulness and his fidelity to his Father and his willingness to sacrifice himself so that others can be saved is an example for every one of us. And I hope that we can learn from this and put it into practice every day. Let's close with a word of prayer. And Bill, I think, are you leading the closing? Who's leading the closing prayer, Danny?